There are lots of folks who don't know what the sharing economy means. I think that there's an active discussion among the people who are creating the sharing economy as to what exactly the sharing economy encompasses. I think of it as having a few parts. First, there's a new set of businesses that are allowing us to make more effective use of the physical assets that we have. Our cars, our homes, our roof space. And so any new business which is coming up with a new way of providing a service by utilizing existing assets, I think falls under the umbrella of the sharing economy. Among these, perhaps the most interesting ones are peer-to-peer businesses. So this is where the asset or the service in question is owned by one individual and is being provided to another individual. So for example, Airbnb allows people who have space in their apartments or their homes to become sort of temporary hoteliers where they're offering this space to other people. Lyft, Sidecar are services that allow individuals who own cars to moonlight as taxi drivers using the asset that they have, their car. So that's, there are lots of other things that fall under the umbrella of the sharing economy depending on who you ask. There are services where there are marketplaces that allow people to exchange goods and services without using money. I think people think of that as part of the sharing economy. Like other terms that enter the business and popular jargon, social media, I guess e-commerce, like 10, 15 years ago. I think that there's a specific meaning that the term sharing economy is going to take on in a few years that will perhaps be different from our conception of the meaning of the word sharing. And so I think it will just sort of come to mean the set of businesses that are allowing people to utilize their assets and their time more efficiently to provide familiar services to other people. First, one of the reasons why, I got interested in the sharing economy in part because, it represents the latest wave of change that is being caused by digital technology, and I'm interested in change caused by digital technology. But I also was drawn to it because I felt it represented a substantial opportunity for society. And, because if you think about one of the slogans of the sharing economy is access without ownership. So you can have access to things without having to own it. So to me, a natural corollary to that is that perhaps people who couldn't in the past afford to consume things because they couldn't afford to own them may have the opportunity to have access to them. And so the sharing economy represented the potential for sort of equalizing your consumption experience without a corresponding equalizing of wealth or income. Because it's very hard to redistribute wealth, but if you can redistribute access by creating marketplaces in which people who have a lot of stuff have ways of providing access to them to people who don't have a lot of stuff, there's potentially there's a lot of benefit that is possible. Now these marketplaces unfortunately are the hardest to create, commerce that transcends sort of different socioeconomic boundaries. And so I think that if people want to think about or talk about or discuss, where does the untapped potential of the sharing economy lie? It should be towards how do we create marketplaces in our neighborhood that facilitate equalizing access without ownership. Well, there are a number of different factors. A lot of people point to the economic downturn of 2008 as being a factor that led to individuals looking for more cost-efficient ways of leading their lives. To me, that is certainly a factor, but I think of it as more of a catalyst rather than a true cause. I think that we have been sort of, like the economy has been readying itself for the sharing economy for about a decade now. I think that the main causal factors are really the widespread adoption of personal computing and, more sort of importantly, smartphones. These have come about because the companies that make technology these days, it used to be in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s that people who made technology made them for businesses or governments, and the consumers were sort of an afterthought. You'd make PCs for the business, and then they'd make a home computer version. You'd make a spreadsheet and then create a home version. That sort of switched about a decade ago, where now, if you think about the big technology companies, their primary focus are sort of home users or consumers, and then these technologies are then taken and adapted for business. And so this focus of building technology for consumers is a big part of why everybody has the powerful technology in their pockets now that are allowing us to say, well, if someone has a car and is driving around and is willing to give other people rides, we've always had this. It's just that now we have the technology that can connect someone who needs a ride with someone who is offering that ride. So progress in technology and this shift in the focus of technology companies from business and government to consumers, that's one important factor. I think a second factor that has been pivotal in the emergence of the sharing economy has been the growing creation of a digital trust infrastructure. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, we've been using social networking technologies like Facebook and sort of professional networking technologies like LinkedIn for almost 10 years now. What these technologies do is that they take our real-world social relationships, our real-world social capital, and they digitize them and take them online. So we're not using Facebook to make new friends primarily. We're using Facebook to keep in contact with our existing friends. But what this does for a marketplace is that it digitizes all of this social information about who's connected to whom, how strong these social ties are. And now we're seeing the sharing economy being built on top of this infrastructure. So now if I want to use Airbnb and I haven't used it before, there's some level of trust that the person who is going to accommodate me has based on the fact that I'm part of Facebook. They can see who I'm connected to. They can look for shared friends. They can look for friends who have stayed with them. So this is part of what I call the digital trust infrastructure. Historically, we've always had ways in which exchange between people was made more efficient. We have governments that guarantee property rights. This makes exchange more efficient because you know that you can own something once you trade. We have well-developed contract law and courts of law. These things make sort of exchange possible. You don't have to only trade with your friends, you can trade with someone else and you can write a contract. So economists call these entities, property rights, courts, institutions. And I think the platforms like Facebook and LinkedIn sort of represent a new generation of institution-like entities that are allowing us as individuals to trade with other individuals. And so I think I see these two factors, the emergence of the trust infrastructure and the consumerization of digital technologies, as being the two main reasons why the sharing economy has emerged. I suspect that there's a third reason, although I don't have good evidence for it yet. As technology progresses, and over the last 200 years, as we've seen progress in different technologies, we've experienced with each wave of technological progress a progressive isolation of individual activity as well. And so as we get more technologically sophisticated, our economic interactions, like buying stuff, getting services, become increasingly impersonal and individual and isolated. And so we're at a point now where loneliness is actually an epidemic. This lack of human connection has reached epidemic proportions. There's some evidence that suggests that it is responsible for sort of more health-related issues than, anything except cigarette smoking, for example. And I think that a part of people's sort of embracing of the sharing economy, of economic activity that actually involves interacting with their peers, interacting with other human beings, is partly a response to this need for greater human connection. Okay, that's, well, how big is the sharing economy? That's another question that nobody can agree to an answer to. Here's what I will say, that I expect that in the next 5 years, it's going to be a healthy single-digit percentage of the US GDP. It's still small, but it's growing extremely rapidly. And the technological forces that are creating the sharing economy are sort of still powerful. And the need for human connection that I think is also fueling the sharing economy is sort of equally powerful. So what's also interesting is that I think that, some people think of the sharing economy of, accommodation with someone else instead of staying in a hotel, getting a ride in someone else's car instead of taking a taxi or a black car, as potentially being not as good a service as, say, the mainstream service. But I think there's a growing population of people who actually see this as the better alternative. We might have 50 or 100 different kinds of hotels that we can stay in, different types. You've got all-inclusive resorts, you've got business hotels, you've got motels. But if you think about the variety that Airbnb offers, there are 600,000 listings on Airbnb, but there's such a broad range of short-term accommodation now that we're entering that phase where people aren't going to be seeing it as the low-cost option. They're going to be seeing it as the expanded variety option. Similarly, when you want to rent a car, Hertz, Avis, sort of Dollar, Enterprise, the range is pretty limited. On the other hand, now with peer-to-peer car rental platforms like Getaround and Relay Rides in the United States, Drivey and Snapcar in Europe, the possible range of options that you have for car rental has expanded dramatically, because now it's not just the cars owned by Hertz and Avis, it's cars owned by anybody. And so you'll see Porsches, Lexuses. And so rather than owning one car, you might say, well, let me not own a car, but if I feel in the mood to drive a Ferrari today, let me sort of rent one and sort of take it for a spin for a couple of hours. So that kind of thing is expansionary for the economy. It sort of grows the economy because it's creating more variety and it's creating more efficiency. So I think that this is big and this is here to stay. I don't think that it will completely replace our existing system. But yeah, healthy single-digit percentage of GDP would be my prediction. Well, I think we've seen these things called regulatory hacks many times in the past, where a new technology comes along and it facilitates sort of the bypassing of existing rules. And so the Lyft platform facilitates bypassing the existing rules that govern taxis. The Airbnb technology sort of bypasses. I think that what we have here is particularly interesting because what the sharing economy represents is new technology-enabled ways of providing familiar services. And we're not talking about newfangled search technology or newfangled social networking technology. We're talking about finding a place to stay, getting a ride, increasingly sort of getting your energy, getting your healthcare, getting your education. All of this is on the horizon. And so we've got familiar ways of getting these services already that have evolved over the last few decades. And in a city like New York, for example, because these shared services, like, sort of renting an apartment, taking a taxi, are so critical to the functioning of the local economy. They're not just sort of fringe services for tourists. They're central to how we live. And so we have a deep and long-standing set of regulations that have evolved in order to keep doing this the old way safe, and in order to, sort of balance the individual need with society's needs. So we have a medallion system that limits the number of taxis on the road. We have metered fares. We have sort of an elaborate licensing process that people go through. And all of these came out of perhaps what were originally valid either safety concerns or concerns that if left to itself, the market isn't going to fulfill a need of society. So, we have regulations about a minimum number of wheelchair accessible vehicles because left to itself, the market isn't going to provide a sufficient number. And that's the kind of situation where you want the government to step in and correct things. So with the sharing economy, we're dealing with disruption of this familiar services with these deep sort of long-standing rules and regulations that have emerged, that have been created to regulate things the old way. So now you've got new models, they don't fit into these old regulatory boxes. Changing regulations is really hard. And part of the process is that new businesses come along, they create new ways of doing things, and they sort of bump up against these old regulations. And collectively, we then sort of start to look at these regulations and say, should a taxi cab medallion in New York City really cost $1 million? When we have, sort of GPS technology, do we really need sort of devices installed in taxis in order to sort of meter fares? If we have 4 or 5 competing services, do we really need the government to decide how much, people can be charged? If you've got well-established trust systems and sophisticated online reputation and review systems, do we really need the level of cleanliness inspection that we used to need? And so I'm not saying that the answers to these questions are, no, we don't need any of this regulation. I'm just saying that this is the kind of disruption that calls these things into question. And I think where we're going to settle is with a new division of responsibility between the platforms, the marketplaces like Airbnb and Lyft, that provide these services or facilitate the provision of these services, and the city and state governments. I think there will be a transferring of some of the responsibility from the city and state governments to the platforms. This is a painful process because anytime there is a regulatory disruption like this, there are stakeholders who make their livelihood doing things the existing way, and who sometimes have valid objections, who sometimes will, institutions have this habit of sort of doing everything they can to preserve their existence. And so we're sort of in the middle of that process now. Now, what I think is really important for city governments to think about is that this kind of peer-to-peer exchange is going to be an increasingly large part of the economy. So if you're a city which is welcoming of this kind of commerce, you're going to experience higher rates of economic growth. If you are a city that is resistant to this kind of exchange, then it's likely that you're going to make your city a less desirable city for people to come and innovate in, for people to live in. And so I think city mayors and city governments need to start thinking about the sharing economy as an engine for future innovation and economic growth. And I'm not suggesting that they rip out their old rules and let the sort of marketplaces function sort of unregulated, but I think, sort of a new approach to oversight, a new delegation of responsibility to the marketplace, and, a desire to sort of actually understand things before deciding how they should be regulated is critically important for a city that wants to actually continue to attract people and be supportive of the innovation and the new consumption that comes with the sharing economy.